Okay, so the first thing you need to understand about the trans debate is that it isn't pro-trans versus anti-trans. It's trans as a scientific phenomenon versus trans as a spiritual and religious experience. The strangest thing about all these accusations of transphobia that get thrown around everywhere is that the most transphobic thing you can do is try to look into the phenomenon of trans, is to try to understand the science of it, to try to understand what's going on in people's minds, what the psychology is behind trans, what the biology is, what the whole phenomenon is scientifically. That is the most transphobic thing that you can do. When people accuse people of being outrageous bigots, what they mean is that those people are getting a little too close to figuring out what's going on scientifically, which is sort of like reaching behind the magic curtain. And these people, activists, strictly want the phenomenon of trans to be seen as just a magical, spiritual experience, and they don't want anyone to burst that spiritual experience with a realistic understanding of what trans is. Let me give you a few examples. The two biggest sort of battlefields in the trans dispute right now are something called self ID and around the treatment of children. And both of these disputes involve two perspectives, one that is highly scientific and rational, and one that is highly irrational and sort of spiritual and new agey and doesn't want to look at facts. So, self ID is a shorthand term for a dispute about who counts as trans and how do we distinguish a trans person from someone who isn't trans. This is a dispute about where the line is between just being a guy or being a trans woman, or where the line is between just being a woman or being a trans man. How do we define that line? A scientific rational mind would say, what is the difference? What are the steps that one takes to become trans? What are the material measurements we would make between somebody who's just saying that they're trans and somebody who really is trans? Even that language between really is gets really tricky really fast when you try to look into this rationally. But the kind of new agey spiritual, this is just an experience point of view says if someone says that they are trans, it's impossible for them to be lying. It's strictly the case that they must be experiencing this transcendental experience of transness. And how dare you ever question that? You must be a bigot. You are never to question anybody's statement that they are trans. It is strictly impossible that anyone could ever say that they're trans and not really be trans. It's strictly impossible that there are different ways that people might come to understand that they are trans. It's strictly impossible that a con man might say that he's trans to get, say, a grant that's only available to trans people or to enter into a political position. There are shortlists that are women only, and sometimes, that this is all to spiritualists. These very technical, very obviously plausible and possible phenomena are impossible. It is impossible that anyone could ever claim to be trans without being so. But a rational mind would say, well, of course that's possible. Of course, if we don't define the steps that one has to take to become trans, if we don't actually have a means of looking at somebody who's claiming to be a trans woman and verifying whether they really are or not, again, this is language that starts to fall apart once you even look at it. If there's no way of actually understanding what trans is, then there are going to be problems. A lot of outsiders are starting to see this. A lot of outsiders are seeing that activists are talking in this language of absolutism and spiritualism, like trans people are this and trans people are that, and are starting to ask these rational questions like, okay, but who are trans people? How do you define a trans person? How do you distinguish a trans person from a non-trans person? How do you verify this? They're starting to figure out that it's not anti-trans to just try to examine this phenomenon with a rational lens. And this all comes to a head around laws that are being passed in legislatures across the world that pass bills called self-ID bills. These are bills that enact and enshrine in law that if somebody states that they are experiencing the spiritual essence of transness, then by law, everybody is obligated to treat them as the literal, factual, biological sex that they say that they are, rather than what they materially are. So I, right here, could look you in the eye and tell you that I am female, and legally, you would have no recourse whatsoever to state that you doubt whether I'm telling the truth, to state that you're skeptical about whether I'm really experiencing transness, whatever they need. You have no legal recourse whatsoever. I could do anything that a female does strictly on my say so. Now, a rational person would say, okay, that doesn't make any sense. But again, we're dealing with this kind of new age spiritual interpretation of transness, where these kinds of questions of practicality are not allowed at all. So that's the problem with self-ID. Laws are coming out that are deeply irrational, that don't take into account very real, necessary questions about what it is that makes someone trans versus what it is that doesn't. The next big one is the treatment of children. All of a sudden, in the last 10, 15 years, we started declaring that there's such a thing as a trans kid. For the longest time, you know, transsexualism really started emerging in the middle of the last century as technology started making advances around surgeries and things like that. And slowly it evolved into transgenderism, and now it's really expanded into something that is being taken so literally that we're acting as though we can identify transness in children and even babies sometimes. And a scientific, rational person might look at the diagnosis of transness in children and wonder, where's the evidence behind this? They might assume, a lot of outsiders assume, well, there must be evidence. There are doctors who are doing this, who are diagnosing children as trans. Doctors are generally smart, good-intentioned people. Obviously, there must be something to this. There must be some evidence base that says that some kids are trans or have some essence of transness somehow. That's what a rational thinking person would say. Now, the New Age spiritualists wouldn't even do that. They would just, if somebody declares that a kid is trans, again, this activates that sort of spiritual sense. Well, that person must be a trans person and they must be protected and they're so, so special. But let's go back to the scientific minded person, the rational minded person who has good intentions, who thinks there must be something behind all these diagnoses of transness in infants and young people and young adolescents and teens and young adults. Well, they probably assume that there is an evidence base behind all of this. You know what? There isn't. There is no evidence behind this. There used to be, in the clinical environment around treating young people who experience gender dysphoria. This is the scientific term for young people, or for people in general, who experience distress around the sex of their bodies. It's called gender dysphoria. And there are many treatments for it. Psychotherapy, and as a last resort, an extreme treatment, is modifications to one's body to alleviate gender dysphoria. This is genital reconstruction surgeries, cross-sex synthetic hormones, artificial breasts, that kind of thing. This stuff is, according to the scientific mind, these are medical treatments to alleviate the medical psychological condition of gender dysphoria. And this was only ever applied to young people through a sort of patient model called watchful waiting. This was where if a child presented in a clinic as being deeply distressed about the sex of their body, a little boy, say, who just really didn't like being a boy, was adamant that he was really a girl, seemed to associate more with girls than boys, the clinicians would assume that this was just a natural phase that that little boy was going through, but we would keep an eye on the boy to make sure that his mental health stayed in check, to make sure that he was doing okay. Because it's very, very, according to the scientific, rational worldview, it has been very common for decades to observe that some little boys are naturally very feminine right from early childhood. They tend to become distressed about the fact that they're boys. They tend to latch onto girl toys, and they tend to sort of start to think that maybe they really are girls instead of boys because they see that they have more in common with little girls than with little boys. But now these children almost invariably grow up, these little boys, and also vice versa for little girls who think they're boys. They tend to grow up to become homosexual. They get over their distress about thinking they're the opposite sex. They end up just gay and they move on. So as these kids are experiencing this distress, we try to comfort them and we try to treat them okay, but we under the assumption that they're probably going to get over their distress about what sex they are and figure out, and it's possible, it's likely that they'll figure out that they're gay, and then they'll just grow up into happy, healthy, gender non-conforming homosexuals. And that was the watchful waiting model. And a small number of these very, very feminine gay guys or very, very masculine butch lesbians would grow up and be gay and lesbian, but also be so distressed about their gender nonconformity that they might choose to undergo sex changes and to adopt a trans identity to help them alleviate their distress. This is all very clinical, it's all very science-based, and it's all very empathetic and sympathetic. There's nothing anti-trans about this entire model. Okay, you're distressed about what sex you are. Let's try to keep you calm and help to comfort you. Let's assume that you're very likely to get over that and that it's just a phase. And if after a prolonged period of time you never get over it, then let's look at possibly trying to comfort you by giving you physical sex change characteristics, but never assuming that you're literally the wrong sex. Okay, so that's the sort of scientific, rational worldview around gender dysphoria, particularly young people and children who have gender dysphoria. Now we have something new, the spiritual worldview, the spiritual essence of transness worldview. This is called the affirmation model, and it has literally taken over the clinical environment. Under the affirmation model, the second a child experiences any distress around what sex they are, the second a child declares that they think the second a boy declares he thinks he's really a girl, or a girl declares she's really a boy, this is a sign that they have that magical spiritual aura of transness. And if anyone dares to try to interfere with this magical, beautiful trans soul, then they're a horrible bigot who is trying to inflict conversion therapy on this magical child who's just such a wonderful example of the wonderful world of LGBTQ, LMNOP, XYZ. This is a very sort of irrational, new agey, it's sort of emotive but not rational way of thinking, and it has completely taken over the clinical model of how to treat young people who are experiencing confusion around gender and sex. And it really came to a head, specifically with one of the world's leading clinicians of young people with gender dysphoria. This is a man named Ken Zucker, and he ran a clinic for young people with gender dysphoria right here in Toronto, where I am. And he pursued the watchful waiting model. The assumption with these distressed kids that came into his clinic was that they were going through a phase of confusion, and it may likely have been a result of their confusion around being just naturally gender nonconforming and probably gay, and he would treat these people as such. And then, if their distress persisted, he would help them undergo physical characteristic changes so that they could superficially live under the role of the opposite sex and become trans people. Blah, 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 blah. But these new spiritualists came to town and decided that the watchful waiting model was bigoted and transphobic because it wasn't asserting that any child who ever says that they're really trans is really trans. So what they did is they launched a smear campaign against Ken Zucker and eventually got him fired. His clinic was shut down by the hospital network that it was run under, and replaced by a new clinic, essentially, that was operating under this new affirmation model. This new, every single kid who says they're trans is really trans, and they have a magic spiritual soul of the opposite sex. This new model came into town. Well, the whole thing was bullshit. The evidence that was used to get Ken Zucker's clinic shut down was completely trumped up nonsense. There was somebody who testified that Ken Zucker had called him something like a dirty little vermin or something like that, that he had been this evil, monstrous person who was just so mean to these poor, precious trans clients of his. Of course, it was all nonsense. Eventually, a journalist spoke to this person who testified that Ken Zucker had treated him horribly. And it turns out that that person couldn't even identify what Ken Zucker looked like in a photograph. This was just a completely made up, invented, fabricated story by the spiritualists who just, kind of seem to be farther and farther out of touch with reality every day. So there's this real problem going on with the treatment of young people right now. There's a war between the science and rational based clinicians who believe in watchful waiting and who believe in treating this phenomenon of gender dysphoria and transgender with deep care and empathy, but with a scientific and rational lens, with the goal of the best outcomes for the clients, always first and foremost in mind. And this new guard of spiritualists and pseudo-religionists and sort of this new age culty kind of phenomenon where they don't actually seem interested in the outcomes of their patients. They just want to affirm all these kids as trans, give them all this sex change surgery and hormones and medicine. The more experimental, the better, and the more extreme, the better, and the younger these kids, the better. And then they send them out the door and assume that they've just, they've created another magical trans person, and they don't look at the outcomes. They don't want to hear whether these kids are doing well or not, whether they're adjusting well in their new transgender life, whether the surgeries that they were prescribed turned out well or not. They don't want to hear any of it. And there isn't any follow-up work being done. This new affirmation model that has taken over the clinical environment around young people, no one is looking into whether it's producing better outcomes for these kids. And the reason no one's looking into that is because that by nature is a scientific endeavor, to follow up and look for evidence for whether your beliefs and your treatment system works or not. That's just not how spiritual minds work. That's how scientific minds work. So they're deeply hostile to any kind of evaluation on a scientific basis of their own treatment model. So if you're watching this right now and you are a parent of a confused young person, looking to navigate this terrain and looking to figure out how to negotiate with the clinicians that you're going to be interacting with to help your child and to guide your child through their gender dysphoria, or if you're perhaps a journalist or just a curious person who wants to look into this further, I propose a really good way for you to figure out, every time you go to speak to an expert, somebody who declares themselves an expert in gender dysphoria and transgender, the first thing you need to do is figure out whether they are a science-minded, critical thinking person who is looking at transgender from a scientific lens, or whether they're a spiritualist and a sort of new age religionist who treats transgender like it's this spiritual essence. And there's one question that you can ask anyone who purports to be an expert, so that you can determine whether they're a scientific expert or a religious expert in transgender. And it's this. Ask them to define biological sex. Now, you and I know, I'm going to assume you, the viewer, have enough of a scientific mind that you know that biological sex is the same in humans as it is in every other mammal, because you believe in evolution like any sane person does, and you understand that humans are mammals like every other mammal, and we come in two sexes. Biological sex has males and females, and yes, there's a small number of people who were born with sort of birth defects, and that can get a little complicated, but that's completely irrelevant to this phenomenon, so we'll ignore it, set that aside for now. By and large, there are males and females, and you can identify whether someone is male or female in utero with an ultrasound long before they're even born. This is the rational scientific understanding of what biological sex is. So if you're going to talk to a clinician or anyone who purports to be an expert in transgender, ask them if they believe that biological sex in humans is the same as every other mammal and that it comes in two sexes, male and female. These sexes cannot change, and that they are observable in utero long before birth. If that person wavers or hesitates and uses language like, well, actually sex is assigned at birth, no, that's a spiritualist. That's somebody who is looking at the phenomenon of gender dysphoria and this strange obsession with people changing their sex through a kind of spiritual, politicized, new agey, pseudo-religious lens. The sentence sex assigned at birth is an instant flag that you're looking at somebody who's biased. If somebody's truly science-based, they will say sex observed at birth. They will understand that biological sex doesn't literally change and that hormones, puberty blockers, all these cosmetic surgeries, double mastectomies, vaginoplasties, orchiectomies, etc., 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 that this is superficial treatment to help someone's psychiatric condition. This is really important. You journalists out there, when you're trying to learn, we're trying to get straight information about what's going on with the treatment of these young people, make sure that every single person you speak to tells you whether they're aligned with the scientific viewpoint on gender or whether they're aligned with the spiritual new age viewpoint by getting them to tell you whether they believe biological sex is real or not right up front. I hope that at least some of you parents out there, especially who are struggling with children with dysphoria, can use this information. If you take your child to a gender clinic, make sure you ask every single person who sees your child, endocrinologist, psychologist, psychotherapist, intake doctor, ask every single one of them what their opinion is on biological sex. And if any of them gives you some spiritual pseudoscience mumbo jumbo that's worse than creationism, that sex is a spectrum, or that it's assigned at birth like the magical sorting hat from Harry Potter, get the hell out of there. That's not somebody who is science-based. So this is the war. We're not dealing with anti-trans versus pro-trans. We're dealing with trans as a sympathetic scientific phenomenon that needs to be understood and treated with all sympathy and empathy and scientific rigor, and this very politicized, very spiritual new agey movement that just wants to shut down all critical thinking and treat it as just a big glittery love fest. That's what's going on. Thanks.